This is John Nugent.
I'm Ron Peters.
And I'm Sam Long.
Welcome to the After Class Podcast.
Because the best conversations happen
After class. Thanks for joining us in another episode of the After Class Podcast. We're glad to have you along. We mentioned in previous episodes that we're done with classes and such, but the work doesn't stop and the new students don't stop. Today we had a registration day, one of 4 maybe, where we encourage students to come and get ready. And it's really early, but I think studies have shown that the sooner the student comes and registers and does those things, the higher probability they will actually then matriculate.
And we care a lot about that.
Yeah. And so today was the first day and had some new students on campus, and Todd and I registered a couple, and Ron and John watched.
I had nothing to do today. No students attached to me, no ABSers. So, yeah, I was just kind of staring from the sidelines. Although, well, yeah, I was just staring from the sidelines. I was about to say something else. I'm like, forget it. Just move on. Keep moving.
Yeah, I don't advise anymore or
Right.
register students anymore, but that didn't mean I was just staring today.
Okay.
Well, I mean, as VPAA, you do have a certain invested,
Somebody's triggered over there. It's fine.
investment in what's going on around you.
Hey, I work too. Yeah, I'm just rotating door people in my office because of things that are going
Yes.
weird with registration or
fair
awkward with
enough.
this student or professor.
But we were registrating.
Registrating.
Yeah, I know.
That's correct.
So
Registering.
let's just start this whole thing over. Registering in Populi today, is that right? Everybody was using Populi to get
It's Populi.
Populi.
And we were
Sorry
using
about
it. Our new
I can
learning
never get my
management.
Latin correct.
Our new learning management system. It was great. I've had no problems. Love it so far. So we're excited about that.
People could not register people in Populi.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Wow.
but some hiccups, but
Well, I mean, it's our first day using it, so come on, let's have a little bit of grace.
we were working out some kinks, but we can't wait to be fully transitioned into Populi because Blackbaud was the bane of our existence for how many months? I don't know, 10, 12?
Over a year.
Over a year
For some of
yeah,
us.
I agree.
But then people don't care about that unless you do. If you want our,
Unless you do, right?
If you're
an
in higher
institution
education.
thinking about going to Blackbaud, give us a call.
We'll talk to you
Yeah.
about that.
But it's fun. There, I had a mixture of some transfers and some new students, and the new students are kind of nervously like, "Yeah, I guess, sure, I don't know," because it's a new experience for them. But that's kind of fun.
What I most look forward to on registration day is Greg's Burgers.
Oh my gosh, those are so good. The Stauffer burgers are fantastic, and they're big, meaty burgers. And
Half
at the
pound.
end of one, I'm like, I want another one, and I know I'm going to feel uncomfortable if I do. So today I did a half, and I'm just right. So
Okay.
1.5 Stauffer burgers.
That was only like 3 pounds of meat. That's impressive.
Big guy, big
Yeah.
stomach.
What he does, he just gets one of those huge tubes of ground beef and he just cuts it into and just like there's just this gigantic roll of meat, and then he
Yeah.
cooks it up.
And they're thick. They're
and,
thick.
and he knows how not to overcook it,
Yeah, agree.
which is I only really get from Greg.
Totally agree with that.
He's not afraid of there being some actual pinkness and even redness in the middle of the burger, which I appreciate. Not everyone does. People like the overcooked, grayed
Brown in the
piece of
middle,
meat, but
We had very good friends in Tennessee, and back in our ministry days in Tennessee, one of them got E. coli from a Wendy's burger, and now my wife is not capable of not overcooking meat of any kind.
Yeah.
I mean, we were visiting her in the hospital when it wasn't clear that she was going to make it through, kind of
my
thing,
God.
and
A little
that
terrifying.
left an indelible impression.
so she prefers the hockey puck burger.
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
pre-cooked.
Pre-cook it. I'll cook it again. We might make sure everything is beyond dead. Yeah. We also had our Memorial Day weekend this last weekend, so we got to wait for our anniversary, so that was really nice. Suzanne and I have been married for 29 years. We're very happy to announce that. So it was a good weekend and just a good Memorial Day, family fun, burgers, grilling, all that kind of stuff. I've been eating a lot of burgers. I just realized that.
Could
lot
eat
of
worse
burgers.
things.
I agree. I'm okay with it too, since I love burgers.
Beth and I were in Virginia Beach for a wedding for our niece, and we had smash burgers on the grill on Sunday, which were like very thin compared to Greg's really
Same
thick
thing, yes.
burger.
Exact opposite.
But yeah, it turns out my niece's wedding is on. They're going to share an anniversary with Ron and Suzanne, so that's
Yeah.
pretty exciting.
I have to get their names and just start sending them cards randomly. It's like, happy anniversary from people you've never met.
But yet, this thing happened to Beth and I for the first time. You know how at weddings they have like all married couples onto the floor and like, hey, if you've been married for like 2 years, stay on the floor. Everyone else get down. If you've been married for 5 years, and like Beth and I were among the last two couples standing.
Wow.
That's cool.
Yeah. Both of us have been married for 32 years, and but that was it.
Wait, you and
It's-
Beth, or you and the other couple?
Beth and I have been married for 32 years, and the other couple were married to
Yes.
each other for 32 years. But it was kind of sad that, like, that's it.
Yeah.
Like, but Beth's parents were at the wedding, but they were not in the reception hall at that time. They were, obviously they were married
Easily.
longer than Beth and I.
Much more. I was at a wedding not too long ago where my parents were there, and they were the last one standing. At that point, I think they've been married for 58 years. They've now hit 60 years. So that's
Wow.
pretty remarkable. Yeah, 60 years is fantastic.
How about you guys? Memorial Day weekend.
We went to Columbus for my niece's graduation party. It's Columbus, is what it is. So it's fine. It's good. She's finishing up and going to Ohio State. Like, there's a lot of downsides of going there. It's in Ohio, and she's going to Ohio State. But we're celebrating her
Yeah.
getting her thing done. So,
No offense to our Columbus listeners.
I mean,
out
there's
there.
some. But it was good. My brother had come up, so my family was there. So it was a good little time. Congratulations to Hannah.
I got sick a couple weeks ago.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Good for you.
And I was doing all right. And then last week it got really bad. So I was just laid up all week last week. So our Memorial Day weekend was me kind of emerging from the den of,
The fog.
of terrible. And so we did some small stuff. We went and played a round of disc golf with a friend of ours. And it was cool. My wife doesn't get to play disc golf very much anymore. So it was really great to be able to get her back on the course.
Did she
pretty-
play well?
Yes, if you ask her, she's like terrible, but she just walks up onto the tee and drives 250 feet, which for a female player that plays like 2 rounds a year is incredibly far. And she's really good, but just doesn't get a lot of opportunity to play.
Yeah. That makes sense.
That's our highlight, a round of disc golf. So.
That's not a bad highlight, though. If you guys were having fun, that's all that matters as a couple.
Yeah.
Enjoy yourselves.
And that fourth voice you heard was Todd Jones, our guest speaker on the After Class podcast for our Spiritual Disciplines series. And you're still with us, and we haven't scared you away, and our listeners seem to like what you're doing, so we're going to keep going until we finish this series. How many do we have left?
There should be 4 left. 4
Including
left.
today?
Including today. Yep.
Got it.
There's 12. There's kind of a round number for the 3 categories that he creates. There's 4 in each category, which today marks the transition from the outward disciplines to the corporate disciplines. And that transition is, I think, really strategically done because the discipline for today is confession. And I think by placing confession at the beginning of the corporate disciplines, I think Foster is doing a kind of subtle, not so subtle reminder that this is not a between you and God thing, which the Protestant tradition has reacted strongly against the Catholic tradition and has said, confession is just between you and God. It's like a salvation question where you go before God, you ask for forgiveness for your sins, and then your slate is wiped clean. We've got this sort of narrative around a kind of anti-Catholic confession. And Foster just goes, nope, this is corporate. Everything about it is corporate. So, well, that's not totally fair. Everything. There's certainly an individual component. He doesn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say there's ways for you to confess by yourself, but positioning it as a corporate discipline and positioning it at the beginning, I think is really helpful as a reminder to set the stage for what confession is. So are we ready for definitions? Is it time?
Well, it does make me think because, like, you hear it in the popular discourse. People are like, you can't judge me. This is just between me and God. It's like, I can see that growing out of the Protestant tradition. Like, this is just between me and God. And so there might be that ripple effect that it's not just a Christian thing, but a broader cultural thing in the American tradition. So I think this is a good conversation for us to have. Sorry, I jumped in there.
Go for it.
That's great. Yeah. Okay. So Foster's definition for confession is a discipline of grace that allows individuals to experience deep forgiveness and inner healing through the act of confessing sins. Now, I'm going to say it before anybody else says it. You are not allowed to use the word to define the word. So that has been said. Now, go ahead.
Yeah. Already got one against you there. Oh man, a discipline of grace. Why does he say that? Why does he call it a discipline of grace? I'm curious about that language.
I think there's a concrete answer to that, so I'll jump in really quickly. In the chapter, he wants to make a very big deal about the reliability of God's forgiveness. God has proclaimed, I am a forgiving God, and God can be trusted to forgive. And so he's really trying to ground everything about confession in the confidence of the believer that God is a forgiving God.
Okay. Because those first words just really stuck out to me, and I'm like, let's get a little bit more on that. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, it stuck out to me too. Just, I mean, I feel like they're all on some level of discipline of grace, but I get the specific focus on this triggers a gracious response from God, right? Is that what you think he's saying?
Yeah, yep.
Okay.
Well, I can see where it would combat, I think, what a lot of people's instinct. Like, if I confess, then all I can expect is punishment. And so confession becomes something you're disinclined to participate in because I don't want the negative effects, the pain or whatever that's going to come as a result of that. And so to be able to first characterize it as an opportunity for you to experience God's grace, not his judgment, not his anger, not his punishment, but confession opens you up to experiencing grace, I think is an important first step for people to begin to move into this particular discipline.
Do you think he says deep forgiveness to counteract the lesser version of forgiveness that exists in our world? That's probably not actual biblical forgiveness, but what we equate with forgiveness?
Yeah, to keep it short, I would say I think that's exactly what he's doing.
You
Yeah.
don't have to keep it short. We got 45 minutes.
We got a lot of time to fill here. Well, what would be the shallow forgiveness that you're talking about?
I don't know, a world that like forgive but don't forget. Like, okay, like we'll keep moving on, but I'll never forget, or things like that. That is not restorative forgiveness.
Yeah.
It's yes, I'll check a box, but there's not been a change of attitude, perspective, and you're holding something against someone still, even though you quote forgive them. Does that make sense?
It does.
And,
I
and
get
that's
that.
not biblical, but that's how we often function.
You're right. I think that people do have a hard time with that moving on. It's like, I'm always going to hold this over your head. I'll say the words, but every time you look at me, you're going to know that there's still this part of me that's remembering what you did, and it's always going to affect the relationship.
I will say, but I think part of that is because we don't really do real confession either.
Fair enough.
Like, I'm sorry for getting caught, not sorry for the action, right?
Right, yeah.
And so it's not surprised that there are lesser forms of confession and lesser forms of forgiveness because we're not doing it the way I think God intends us to.
So deep forgiveness requires deep confession.
Deep acceptance of what we've done, contrition. Well, I don't know if we're jumping ahead or not, but yes, I would agree with that.
Let's get to Todd's definition because he actually defines confession.
Well, as a reaction to using the word in the definition, I have another alternate. Here's how I define confession: intentionally disclosing our mistakes to trusted members of our community.
Why did you choose the word mistakes instead of sin?
Because I teach Christian faith at the 100 level. We have a wide array of people in there. So I that is an intentional choice. Mm-hmm. What exactly do we mean by sin?
Right.
Do we mean the things which I've been told in Sunday school are bad, are going to make me go blind, or, like just all of the wild stereotypes associated with this very loaded word. So I want to define mistakes broadly, rather than try at this early stage of the Christian faith class to reclaim a definition of sin. We spend time on sin conceptually in another place rather than on confession. And so it is an intentional choice. I don't know, did I address your...
You addressed why. Yeah. I'm not sure I agree, but because I totally hear what you're saying, right? Yeah. It's a 100 level class. I think mistake has with it, for me, that again, there's an intentionality with sin. It's not like, oh, I was supposed to turn left, but mistakes there's not as much intentionality. It's like, I was trying to do the right thing, it just didn't quite happen. No, sin is intentionally saying, this is the standard, I refuse to go there. And so, for me, I wish maybe there's a third word that's not as loaded as sin, but also has more than mistake.
Yeah, mistake sounds very external, it's very much actions. And that's certainly a part of it. I'm not trying to remove that from the definition. But going back to what you're saying, Sam, I think that you're making a really good point. And it goes back to that idea of deep confession, because deep confession would be to recognize that my bad decisions grow out of thoughts in my mind and priorities in my heart that are out of line with God's good design. And so to confess is to say there's something inside of me that still isn't aligned with God and is finding its way out in these really horrible, decisions that I make. And so that kind of confession, I think, I keep using the word, I almost want to stop using the word confession, but that kind of action forces us to admit things about ourselves that often I think people don't want to admit. It's just so fundamental, but I think it's really important.
About trespasses.
Oh, yeah, that's
That's a much more accessible
that'll
word.
strike the Gen Zers right.
I know, because there are certain places where, I think of like in the New Testament where the word sin, hamartia, but then you have other words where it's not sin, but it is that word trespass. And I still wonder why they choose those words in some places and not in other. This is where I'm really getting into the tall weeds, but it's like in the Lord's Prayer, it's not sin. It never uses that word. It's that word trespass. And I'm like, why? Why are you using it there?
I love that word, though, trespass. Like, you shouldn't go there.
Get off my lawn.
There's a sign. You shouldn't have gone there, and you did.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's more of, like, it's not necessarily a mistake. Like, I got lost, and I went down the wrong
Misread the
road,
map.
and I wasn't supposed to. But, yeah, trespass is I crossed a line, and I shouldn't have. But not that I'm, lobbying for trespass as the new word to replace sin or mistake.
Right.
It's my Catholic youth, it's just a term that's when we talked about sin and forgiveness, we use the word trespass in the Lord's Prayer. So it's out there.
Well, and it's the right word, at least the best word I know of so far in the Lord's Prayer. Forgive us our sins is actually not the best word, but trespass is much closer to the mark, without a doubt.
What do you think about failures? Like, because your definition, intentionally disclosing our mistakes, our failures, because then it doesn't have necessarily the spiritual baggage, but it also shows like I didn't meet a standard. I don't know.
Yeah, if our audience is mature believers that have already assented to the way of Christ and are trying to live that way, and they have a kind of Christian vocabulary, I think the word is sin.
Yeah.
To be fair, and to agree with what you kind of led with. But defining that the baggage, like all of the baggage that term carries, all the shame that term carries, like so much about what Foster's trying to do is position confession as a way to liberate us from that shame too. It's part of what he means by inner healing, deep forgiveness and inner healing. That's part of his definition of confession. So I use mistakes in part to broaden the category, because if it's failures, I'm trying to find a polite way to say the youth have a very high opinion of themselves. Yeah. And if you said, where have you failed? Many of them would with deep conviction say absolutely nowhere. Like I'm incredible.
Really?
It just seems like it's split, we've got we've got the other half that's like, I don't know who I am, I don't know anything, I have absolutely no value. You've it's like
can't do anything right.
Yeah, exactly that. You've got this wide gulf between, and so if you were to say sins, you're always risking alienating. The most inclusive term for the audience that I'm teaching this for most often is mistakes, because a person would be like, oh yeah, I'm a good person, but I make mistakes. Yeah, okay, great. I'm talking about those, right? Let's not enter the ontology of whether people can be good or bad. We're not even going to do any of that. We're just going to say, yeah, there's mistakes, and failures is too intense for the person that already has a negative view of themselves. Trespasses is a little bit too confusing and requires the same level of defining. So for that group, I think I would stand by the choice mistakes. For our purposes, I do think sin, right? When we're abandoning the way of thriving, as we're fond of saying, as we're embracing death rather than choosing life, as we're doing the things that are contra God's design, we need to confess those, or rather I would say intentionally disclose those to trusted members of the community.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
The
trusted
please.
members part. I think that's because I think when people, one of the reasons a lot of people don't like confessing is because they don't feel comfortable with people. They don't want their business out there. They're worried that it'll be used against them, those sorts of things. That's not a trusted community, right? And so the challenge is to create that, to find that, and that's what the church as a whole is supposed to be. But obviously, depending upon the size of your church, that can't be everyone. You just don't have that relationship with everyone. So I think that's an important thing you put in there, because you can't just say, hey, you need to confess your sins to your church. Like, okay, Sunday morning in front of 500 people like that. And then you don't know what, in our days of social media and all the rest, you don't know what's going to happen with that. So people are, rightly a little nervous about that. And so I do appreciate the nuancing that of the trusted members of our community.
Yeah, I agree. And the idea of how do you build trust in a community setting, I think that forces us to think beyond just people getting together for 60 minutes on a Sunday morning to sing songs, hear a message, and then go on their merry little way. That in order to have that level of trust, you've got to be building community relations that find expression 7 days a week. Attending church services, however that looks in your community, is one part of it. But there's got to be other aspects to the relationship that allow you to say, I know that when I confess to you, this is not going to be weaponized against me. And so 1 hour on a Sunday morning, or maybe even another on a Wednesday night, really isn't going to form the kind of community that builds those bonds of trust. And so finding other ways to strengthen those bonds, I think, creates that opportunity. And I think that's why confession is just so hard for people, that for so many, at least American Christians, church is something you do on Sunday and maybe on a Wednesday if you're really committed. Really committed if you go to a Friday night home Bible study. But they kind of all circle around that same idea. And there have to be other things in addition to those that make you go, I can confess and know that I'm going to be safe doing this. And not because you're just going to walk away, but knowing that this could be a redemptive kind of an activity.
You know anything to say about community, John?
No, you guys did great. I
appreciate it.
And I guess your definition, your refinement to trusted members is not just going to strangers. That's not what you do. Confess, not the spiritual discipline of confession is not just blasting on street corners to people. It's a little more intimate. You're disclosing something to people you trust are safe to confess to. So
yeah, people who blast it on street corners we think are weird. That's like too much information. I have no idea why you're telling me this, and you're making me really uncomfortable in the process.
Well, you say that, but there is a pretty trackable psychological trend that's happening among Gen Z right now that is this compulsive self-disclosure thing. Are you familiar with this?
Well, it's not.
You just observed it.
Yes. An outside observer, non-participant.
I get exposed to this doing the sociology prep. Yeah, I teach our sociology class here. And so I don't want to claim to be the expert, but the experts that I read talk about how there is a kind of testing process that Gen Z will use by doing this oversharing early in the relationship. In our day, we would have called it something like love bombing, just like diving headfirst deep into a trust relationship, just being like, here's every trauma I've ever experienced, and using that as like a test to see if this person is viable for friendship. And if you don't then throw those things back in my face, or if you reciprocate in some way, or if our traumas are commensurate, which is the really unhealthy version of it. If we have found ourselves to be similarly traumatized, that means we're compatible friends. Now a friendship begins. And sociologists are pointing out how harmful this is to build relationships this way. But I don't know what other option they have in a way. Their world is so incredibly fake. Living in social media, and so there's this strong desire to self-disclose, which I'm glad you all sort of zeroed in on this word. Like, that word trusted is carrying a lot of freight in my definition for the class that I'm sharing it with, because I'm talking to a room full of people that could conceivably leave that room, go to the lunchroom, and then tell somebody about how, without examples, just the deepest trauma they've experienced in their childhood to a stranger at the cafeteria lunch table. That's a real scenario that they will experience. And that seems a little far-fetched maybe to other generations of listener who say, well, those are carefully guarded secrets. Why would I want to share them? There are two sides to confession. You can get too comfortable oversharing. And I think that the discipline as well is to only share it with people who can do something about it, not just dump it out on everybody who's willing to listen.
Yeah, that's fast. That's a whole another thing about fascinating. Like, we're so tight-vested growing up now. Yeah, it's a whole new world.
Well, yeah, looking at through like a Gen Xer's eyes, it sounds so weird.
You're a Gen Xer?
I'm
That's
a
what you
Gen
mean?
Xer,
Gotcha.
yeah. And so,
You sure you're not a boomer?
Definitely not a boomer. Don't even insult me that way.
Boomers are great. Listeners who are boomers out there, boomers are great. He didn't mean it like that.
Nope.
I lost my thought because now I'm just thinking about all the funny things I want to say about that. No, going back to what you're saying, it just seems so odd to me. But the more you start thinking it through, it's like, well, if I was growing up right now, if I was in my late teens, early 20s right now, I can see where that might become a way of like dealing with the trauma. Like for me, that's just no way to deal with trauma. That's just making it worse. But if you think about the situation that they're in and how they're trying to navigate it, not that it's healthy, but it almost makes sense that oversharing becomes like the gatekeeper for developing intimacy. If you can get past the gatekeeper, then maybe we can have a relationship. And so I'm just going to give you everything and see if you can get through it. I wouldn't do that, but the logic of it begins to make sense in a way.
You want to tell us what the goal of confession is, Todd?
Yeah, I do. I think that confession, so this is a very, very Todd extrapolation. This is all me, so feel free to rip it in a way that you all are so conservative when you talk about Foster. You can let that guard down and tell me the truth about what you think about this. Confession gives us the chance to address mistakes before they become habits, address habits before they become addictions. And confessing, sort of conversely, if we've already made it to the state of addiction, confessing addictions is usually the only way to make progress fighting back against addictions.
Yeah, I was listening to you going progressively through that and thinking through that, especially for new Christians, it's probably a reverse order that you're dealing with, habits, ways of life. Addiction might be a little bit of a strong word, but you're talking about patterns of behavior that are so normal to you that breaking out of them is going to be a difficult process. And especially because a lot of these patterns, you're like, yeah, this is just what normal people do. It's not until we're confronted with God's vision for humanity and his vision for flourishing that you begin to realize that what you think is normal is very abnormal to God. And so being able to train our minds and our hearts to think and value differently is a slow process. And so that's why I was thinking, it's like, in many ways, it seems like a reverse order to take the normal patterns of life and say, I've got to change this. And some people can change some of them relatively quickly, but others, they are stubborn and they do not want to be changed.
I like what you're saying. I think of confession obviously through an Old Testament lens, and so I think of in terms of holiness and clean and unclean, and this idea like there's a standard normal way of living, and when that is broken, that's when sacrifices come in. Not like necessarily just to bring me, like to say, it's not all about sin, right? It's about we're existing in this place, and this is what is normal. And we have gotten out of the normal. And so now we need to return to that. And so for me, I'm viewing it more of that. I understand what you're saying about the habits and addictions and all that. And I'm for all that. But I wonder, for me, it's about expanding the category to say, like we talk about thriving. Like this is the life that this is how it's supposed to be. And when we get out of sync with that, we've got to do something to return back into sync. And it begins with confession. And so for me, that sort of cycle of what life is supposed to be like. I'm viewing it through obviously Old Testament sacrificial terms rather than not.
Yeah, my thinking went along similar lines. Like this covers the human side of it, like what it does for us, right? And it's so helpful to get it out there, so it doesn't become a habit, so it doesn't become an addiction. And I think that's a huge benefit of confession. And I just want to think of it. So that's the anthropocentric side, right? But then there's the theocentric side. Like when we confess, what are we saying about God? That we're saying that God has a vision for my life. God has an order. And I think about the sacrificial system, like when blood is shed, right? Like God's exclusive claim on blood has been violated. And so something needs to happen to restore God's place in our life, in the system, in our community. And so I guess the God side of confession would be an acknowledgement of our utter dependence upon God, an acknowledgement that he deserves better. And that, when I think about David and his prayer, it's scandalous when he's confessing, the sin against Bathsheba and Uriah. He says, against you alone have I sinned, O Lord. It's like, really?
I think Uriah's got a different opinion.
But there's a reason he says that, because in that confession, that psalm, he's recognizing this isn't just about me and my emotional well-being and my habits and practices. It's about God and his sovereignty over my life, over this world, over the way things should be. And I just trampled it. I just trampled God's world. And I want to confess to him, no, Lord, it's not my world to trample however I want. It's yours. And I want to humble myself before you. So I just want to add that part to it.
I think that's there. I want to affirm all that, and not as a pushback, but as like kind of an elaboration on that. I would use the language of accepting responsibility. When I was a kid, it was face the music. I don't know. Do you all have to face the music? Accepting responsibility. I think that all of the things that you just described, as you're like, I want to humble myself, like sort of reorient the correct posture that I'm supposed to have towards God. I think all of that is an admission that I've not been doing it. And I would say that same thing about what Sam was describing as well. That sort of initial, the OT. Things have gotten out of alignment, and I'm going to accept responsibility, confessing that as the first step towards getting them back in alignment. It's not. I don't think it's any less. Because what do I mean to say? The confession is a partnership between us and God. It's like confession is a partnership between us and us when we're confessing to each other, but we're hoping and assuming God is involved the whole way. So that's sort of androcentric, anthropocentric, but it's also theocentric the whole way as well. I don't know if by the time you create this whole picture, I don't know that these things can be disentangled. And maybe that's what you've been saying all along, is that I would want to say these are functionally the same thing. I'm accepting responsibility with a trusted member of my community so that I can get back on the right path and not continue making what I would call the mistake, which we can keep kind of quibbling about that if you want. But like this humbling myself to reestablish my correct posture before God. I think all of that, to me, that's all under this category of accepting responsibility, admitting to a mistake, taking the blame that we rightly deserve.
Yeah, I think you're right. You can't. It would be hard to do one without the other, right? That as though God were not involved in the process. But I think it's vital to understand. But I think as a society, I think we still try to leave God out in various places, and I think it's to our. It's a danger, because the prophets are very clear: where there is unconfessed sin, God doesn't listen. Right? And God doesn't pay attention. And so we may be trying to get back in sync with God or the universe, but if we short circuit God as though he'd not confessing to God as part of it, I don't think it, quote, works. I don't want to turn this into this manipulation thing, but the prophets seem to be pretty on the same page where it doesn't work.
Well, I think you see two extremes on that, because you have people who want to exclude God, like what you're saying, not keeping God part of the process, but then there are the people who are like, it's just between me and God, and I don't need anybody else involved, and it would be wrong to involve other people. And so you see like those two extremes. And what we're trying to say is, what I think what's already been said is that it's a both and. The confession involves both God and that trusted community of believers that we are a part of. And if you exclude one of those, then confession is diminished, and it's really not going to accomplish the good things that confession is supposed to produce. And so it's got to involve God. We have to accept our responsibility before God, and it has to involve a trusted community who can help us to then be transformed by not only confession, but the work of God and His Spirit and all that.
Yeah, that's a great segue to a Foster quote that throws out another word that I would love to hear you all's perspective on. Foster says that confession is a spiritual discipline that not only cleanses, but also restores relationships with God, with others, and with oneself. I'm wondering about that word cleanses. Have we kind of touched on this already, or was there more to say about what the cleansing power of confession?
We haven't talked about it, at least not from the practical side. I mean, I think the Old Testament understanding starts moving in that direction, but so it's tough for me, because I think it gets into kind of like this sort of modern pop psych terminology that I hear, and that's not what the Old Testament was doing. And so I think it's somewhere kind of between those things, where like just saying something out loud doesn't fix it, but it's a start, right? And admitting, taking responsibility, all those things, it's moving in those right directions, because you can't have a restored relationship if you still have this thing that's between you, whatever metaphor you want to use, whether it's a wall, some sort of divider, or like actual things that are impure that are tainting it. And so I like that concept, because it shows it's more of a process, and it's more going into it than just saying words and being done with it. There's a mental sort of psychological aspect to it as well.
And there's Old Testament language there in terms of cleanse my heart, O God, and the hyssop and the white as snow. So
Purify me.
It's I like that part of the definition, because there's saying that out loud, like when we're in sin and we've practiced it or we've done something, it sticks in our mind. It sticks, under our skin, right? And it weighs us down. And there's something about when you confess it to another, it's like you're releasing it. You're cleansing your palate. You're giving yourself a chance to feel fresh again, whole again, potentially holy again, right? Because I've kind of vocalized this and I've gotten it out and I've exposed it to the light, I have a chance of feeling like I have a clean slate. So I think cleansing is a great biblical metaphor for that, I think.
Yep.
I want to shift us towards accountability groups. When I was in youth group, which was maybe a while ago, this was all the rage, and I don't fault any youth ministers or anybody who's trying to push accountability groups. I have concerns about accountability groups. I want to try and sort of throw it all out on the table and then give you guys a chance to reflect. I think that we got inspired by the success of programs like AA and NA. There's this kind of mutual accountability where we're sort of in the same trench, so we understand the struggle. But I think that what we did in our churches a lot of times is we formulated groups around the struggle without the same levels of equipping and training that what AA and NA are able to offer. And we create these accountability groups that end up just being, let's get together and talk about the unique way we failed this week. And we don't necessarily have the tools to actually figure out how to escape this cycle of sin thing that we're in. But we are accomplishing something like confession, because I am telling someone, and this person is someone that I trust. But maybe on some level, I trust them so much that I know that there's actually not much at stake to just tell them the truth, because they're going to love me anyway. And you just wind up with a group of people that just gets together and says, yep, we all failed again. Let's have some pizza. I don't know if this is at all mirroring your experience of accountability groups or if you had a different experience, but I'd love to just throw as we're moving towards the practical suggestions, what do you all think about accountability groups?
I had some similar experience, but also we were often an accountability group based on age and all the dudes in the youth group. And so we weren't all going through the same thing. But I think that what you're voicing is a concern, not just with accountability groups, but with confession as a whole, which is it's not enough just to speak what you've done. There has to be a desire to not do it again, right? We could talk about, is it confession or not? Is saying what you've done confession, or is saying what you've done with the intentionality of saying, but I want to do better and not do that again? Is that real confession? And so if that is, then in a group, there need to be people there to help you along that path, not to say, yeah, man, I struggle with that too. That does suck, doesn't it? Yeah, but what am I going to do to get better? I don't know, man. And so I think your concern about groups just being a place of sharing, not a place of actually growing, is a valid one.
I had positive experiences with accountability groups, accountability partners, but for us, it was, we called it accountability group because we are working on it together. There is an intentionality, and often they were groups that let's study what the scriptures say about this together, and try to discern what it means, and and be proactive about thinking about things, right? And when things get over our head and out of our depth, then it's just like, well, part of how I keep you accountable is you're going to talk to this other person who can help you. And that's, so when we get out of our depth, we would refer people, right, to consult people who are far along in that journey enough to help us out, right, and lead us. So I think, I don't know, I've never been a part of an accountability group that just like said things and felt good about it and went home and returned like a dog to its vomit. Like they always kind of had teeth in them. Yeah.
You guys say
I was going to say, yeah, if you're not asking the question after someone confesses, so what are you doing to get better, then it's not really accountability. Right. And I think that's your point, is like you were in misnamed groups.
But I think that they grow out of a recognition of a legitimate need in the body. Like there needs to be accountability, there needs to be confession. And so people are making positive steps to fill a void. And sometimes you don't know what to do. You know there's a need, you know we need to be doing something about it, but you don't really have much to go on. And so you start out doing something that might be imperfect or whatever, but that's okay because at least you're taking steps. And along the way, you're going to make mistakes, and those mistakes reveal, oh, we need to understand it better. And so instead of seeing accountability groups as either success or failure, but just stages along the way of building us into a body that values confession and restoration, all that, then I don't think we have to necessarily say they've been good or bad, but understanding, yeah, sometimes people were just doing the best they could with what they had, and it's not that it was perfect, but glad you got started. And we have learned from them, and hopefully can start doing a better job along the way.
Yeah, I would say accountability groups are good if they live up to their name, and not if they don't.
Yeah, fair enough.
And I don't have a big dog in the fight to try and convince you all not to do accountability groups or something. Just that I had a mixed bag of experiences, but I think this is a good transition toward the practical suggestions, because what this really drew to mind, especially as John was sharing, some of the most effective accountability that I've had in some of my parenting struggles has come from other parents who have kids my son's age. When I share with them, I was too harsh with my son. Like he did something, I overreacted. That is a kind of confessional accountability that they're sort of in the same experience with me, and we are able to reflect together on, and when I have overreacted to my children, here's what I've done, and here's how we do it. So that is like, okay, sorry, I'm trying to establish two categories here to move us towards practical. So I think there's some things that's like, I have something to confess that I need to confess to someone who's going to be walking with me, and they're going to see me do it wrong, and then say, hey, we've talked about that. Don't do that anymore. That's a kind of accountability that's created by confession, which I think is, in a way, it's a distinct category from the accountability that I need when I go to people like you three, where your kids are out of the house or mostly out of the house. You remember a long time ago some of the struggles that I'm going through now. So I come to you with confession. I don't know what to do. Can you teach me about, like, I'm looking for a mentor. I'm not looking for peer support anymore. This confession might be coming from the place of, I don't know what to do, and I know that my peers don't either, right? Because they're all just as, neck deep in it as I am. I think that this question, right? Who do we confess to? How does confession work in practice? In some ways, it's defined by who actually is going to be able to have answers to the concerns that you have. Because sometimes my friend might not have answers to how do you not lose your cool with your kids, because they might be struggling with it too, versus, maybe in concert with, is this person walking with me in such a way that they can actually notice if I'm not holding up my end of the deal, if I'm not maintaining my calm with my child the way that I'm supposed to. They can see it in real time and say, hey, quit doing that. You guys aren't hanging out with me and my child the way that I do at play dates. So the things that I would confess to, like, mentor figures would be different than what I would confess to peers. It was more convoluted than I meant for it to be, but I'm trying to go quickly. I don't know. Is there something there? Do you have thoughts about that?
I think it's helpful to confess. I mean, I don't want to discourage people from confessing to anyone. Like, just start somewhere. Yeah. But if you're confessing with someone is not helping, they might not be the right person. Right. Like, but I think, there's power in the Word of God. I think I want to confess to people who are going to engage what I'm saying from the perspective of Scripture. Like, I'm going to get a God's eye view responds to my confession. And sometimes the scripture-informed response is going to be silence, right? Because there's nothing to add to Job in his situation. But sometimes it's like, and what the Catholics kind of got right with the confessional booth and confessing to the priest is the priest presumably was someone who was very steeped in the Word of God, and they can bring biblical counsel, right, to the confessor. And so I think in our society, in our day, the professionalization of therapy, has, bracketed out the priests and given it to a person trained in social services and psychology and personality, and that has its place. But I want to keep in the conversation some confession that involves like calling, bringing something before someone who can then bring the Word of God to bear on your situation.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up the point about the priest in the confession booth, because for me, the stereotype is you go in, you confess, it's like, well, say 5 Hail Marys, whatever, and you go on your way, which is not really engaging what you're talking about, right? And so you're saying like, no, it's someone who takes that in and then responds from a biblical perspective with biblical expectations, and I'm all for that. But I think,
do you suspect that's what really happened? Like,
I don't. That's what I'm saying. This
I know the
stereotype.
TV version of
right.
it is.
I don't know.
I just say 12 Hail Marys and you're good. Like, but what is it? The real version of it.
That's a great question. I don't know because I didn't grow up Catholic. You would know better than I would. Yeah. You never went to You never went to confession, did you?
I was young. I didn't sin at that age.
Right. Obviously. Still doesn't. But I do hear what you're saying. Like, I think it's you kind of need a both and, where people who have experienced or are experiencing it, but also from a biblical perspective. I think it's because otherwise you're getting, what sort of advice are you getting? And so I think it's important. That's why when you have a trusted members of the community, like people with different perspectives and different experiences, and you allow and you expect that God's going to use through His Spirit different people to speak into your life, and that's why you got to have a bigger group than one person.
Is that it? We're all looking around going.
There's always more that could be said.
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot. For me, like the Foster's outline about like humility and vulnerability, like it's so vital. Like so many of us, we're just not humble enough to do it. Like I don't want to tell people what I've done wrong because they'll think less of me because of lots of reasons. And so we just don't do confession very well here in, I would say, America. But
well, the vulnerability part, I mean, we could spend a lot of time talking about that because that's really key. Being vulnerable means being open to hurt, open to being defeated or whatever, and people just don't want to do that. So, but sadly, it looks like we're out of time.
Yeah. Last part I would add is that when you have trusted confessors, like people who you can trust with your confession and who take accountability seriously and follow up, some really strong, faith friendships can grow out of being transparent to one another and confessing your sins. And so I wouldn't say the goal of it is to make friends, right, but I think that's another one of those fruits is relationship can happen. And, this is transitioning to corporate practices. And I think part of what happens in confession is, a shared recognition of our shared sinfulness. And, people don't like being around people who are perfect, right? And so they don't mind learning about our frailties as well. And when people share that, it does build bridges of commonality, but hopefully not just to reaffirm one another's sinfulness, but to move forward a little bit.
Yeah, and when things are confessed and it's handled with care, that builds trust. Ron brought up trust early on. And the best foundation for friendship is trust, that you can be counted on, that you won't turn against me, those sorts of things. I mean, confession is a wonderful foundation to build on.
Well, thank you so much for joining us in this episode of the After Class podcast.
After class, because
the best conversations happen
after class.
Thank you again for listening to this episode of the After Class podcast. ACP is hosted by Sam Long, John Nugent, and Ron Peters. Social media pictures and descriptions are provided by Darren Harris. Audio mixing and editing is done by Drew Nyquist. If you've enjoyed this episode of ACP, you might also enjoy GLCC's Master of Arts in Practical Theology degree. In this 36-hour program, you will receive first-rate biblical and theological instruction from John, Ron, Sam, and several of their colleagues at Great Lakes Christian College. To learn more about this program, visit glcc.edu. Get practical and go deep at GLCC.